For over half a century, the automobile has brought death, injury, and the most inestimable sorrow and deprivation to millions of people. That's how the 1965 book Unsafe at Any Speed, The Designed-In Dangers of the American Automobile begins. The landmark non-fiction book was the work of a consumer advocate named Ralph Nader, who put General Motors on blast and caused the kind of firestorm the nation wouldn't see until the release of the Ford Pinto, a car with the kind of build quality typically only seen in fatherless 9-year-olds competing in their first soapbox derby. Unsafe at Any Speed argued that automakers were neglecting the moral imperatives to make cars safer, and that there was a gap between existing design and attainable safety. And while this seems like the kind of thing that could be true of any era of automotive history, Nader argued that few cars on the road represented the auto industry's dereliction of responsibility better than the Chevrolet Corvair. Yeah, that weird little compact with the air-cooled rear-mounted engine, the wishbone front and the swing-axle rear suspension, that beautiful bucket of dreams that didn't have fins or a grille. Somehow, this was the car so dangerous it resulted in a book that changed the way cars were made, led to the formation of entirely new government agencies, and, in a roundabout way, pretty much created the timeline we're currently living in. But was the Corvair really as dangerous as Ralph Nader claimed? How did the controversy surrounding the Chevrolet Corvair change the automotive industry forever? This is RCR Stories, the legacy of the Chevy Corvair. In 1943, Ed Cole was the head of design at Cadillac, just 13 short years after he'd enrolled as a student in the General Motors Institute. Yes, this was a school that existed. And it was while at Cadillac that Cole worked on a concept car that never really got past the prototype stage, but featured a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine. Now, this wasn't exactly the first time General Motors experimented with air-cooled engines, but it's hard to say they ever manufactured one successfully. You see, they tried in 1923 to manufacture an air-cooled engine that utilized copper instead of iron, on the premise that it was a better heat conductor. While air-cooled engines weren't new, no other automaker had produced them to the scale that Chevrolet was intending. And the idea was that since the cars wouldn't need a radiator, they would weigh less and be more cost-efficient to produce. But once the cars were manufactured, it was found that they lost serious compression and power at air temperatures above 60 degrees. They overheated to such an extent that you really couldn't drive them. And so any models that actually made it to showroom were recalled and junked. So you could understand why General Motors didn't really give thought to a mass-produced, air-cooled engine after that, and why the prototype Cole worked on at Cadillac never got off the ground. But in the 1950s, Cole was in charge of a Cadillac plant responsible for manufacturing M42 tanks. These tanks utilized a 930 cubic inch or 15.6 liter supercharged flat six that was, you guessed it, air-cooled. Now, Cole didn't have the power to get GM to advance an air-cooled flat six project when he was lead designer at Cadillac in the 40s. But by May 1952, he had become chief engineer at Chevrolet. And by 1956, he was general manager. And he still had that air-cooled engine from his Cadillac days and from the tank plant running through his mind. Air-cooled engines had been a recurring theme in his professional career. popping back up, causing him to become interested in the concept, only to be proven unviable when management didn't really want to go along with it. But now, he was management, so he was able to finally get the project approved in 1957, having earned enough authority and goodwill at the company. Cole's objective with the Corvair was to go after a strengthening compact market in which Chevrolet wasn't particularly competitive. With the Eisenhower recession of 1957, smaller cars were taking off, to where you were beginning to see more of them on the road than ever before, with cars like the Nash Rambler, the Metropolitan, the Studebaker Lark, and even imports like the Volkswagen Beetle showing how receptive Americans had become to the concept of compacts. And this was the direction Cole took the Corvair, a durable little companion car with exotic styling, but generous interior dimensions. It would be called the Corvair as the result of combining the first 4 letters of the Corvette with the last 3 letters of the Chevrolet Bel Air, essentially creating a portmanteau out of 2 of their most iconic models. And really, using the word air at the end was fitting, since developing the air-cooled 6-cylinder would be the defining challenge of this early stage. Because again, air-cooled engines weren't exactly rare on cars, nor were rear-mounted air-cooled cars for that matter. The Volkswagen Beetle had one, as the car had been designed under the direction of Ferdinand Porsche Sr., but no American automaker had ever mass-produced an air-cooled 6-cylinder before. Only the 4-cylinder Franklins of the early 20th century could really compare at the scale Chevrolet was aiming to achieve. So, in order to actually get this right, Cole and his team looked to Europe for guidance. But they didn't study Ferdinand Porsche's Volkswagen Beetle, no. Instead, they purchased a Porsche 356, designed by Ferdinand Porsche Jr., Ferdinand Porsche Jr., nicknamed Ferry. The team dissected and studied the 356, and it was small block Chevy designer Al Kolb who began to make this a reality. In order to avoid repeating the mistakes of the copper-cooled Chevy, the Corvair would use cast iron cylinders, with a belt-driven fan laid horizontally over the engine. And yeah, there was a lot of trial and error here, as Cole's team tested engine prototypes by inserting them into that Porsche they'd purchased, since this allowed them to maintain secrecy. You see, this car was under the kind of classified protocols you'd typically see in the creation of the newest iPhone. The project was straight up disguised as a new Holden, from using Holden numbering codes for spare parts, right down to issuing purchase orders on Holden stationery, and testing engines inside the Porsche 356 body rather than the Corvairs, which didn't exist yet. Ultimately, the team was able to manufacture a 2.3-liter 6-cylinder. The engine was then mounted in the rear, like something you buy on Adam and Eve. However, for all the team's efforts, and despite the use of a lighter aluminum block, the car still came in 78 pounds overweight, which meant 36-64 weight distribution and less nimble handling than originally intended. The team tried to compensate for this by utilizing the 108-inch wheelbase Y-body platform with a fully independent suspension and, well, okay, you see, this would be the choice that would define the Corvair, for better or for worse, mostly for worse. This had a wishbone up front, but swing axles in the rear. Now, while the Beetle famously had a swing axle rear, the Corvair would be the first mass-produced American car equipped this way. It would also be the first unibody car ever produced by Fisher, the company responsible for manufacturing Chevrolet's car bodies. Drawn by Ned Nettles, under supervision by automotive design icon Bill Mitchell, The car was unique. It had no grille, it had no gaudy fins, and the eye was drawn in by a high horizontal beltline. It was so striking that Mitchell earned an Industrial Designers Institute Award for styling and design for the 1960 Corvair, which would then be named Motor Trend Car of the Year for 1960. But while the car had alluring appeal, it was kind of hard to get past the mechanical design choices. In a controversial decision that would have far-reaching consequences, the team opted to forego standard anti-roll bars and rear leaf springs in order to keep costs lower. So in creating a suspension that compensated for the engine, the group had to stipulate tire pressure standards to compensate for the semi-trailing swing axles, requiring 15 psi up front and 26 in the rear, in order to prevent oversteer. As engineer Charles Rubley would explain in 1960, the model year the Corvair finally released, there were essentially 7 reasons this suspension layout was chosen. It lowered costs, it made for an easier assembly, easier service, a simpler design, and it allowed for the use of coil springs, while also reducing the unsprung weight of the car and ultimately isolating the body from, quote, distortion stresses, end quote. While it seemed like an exotic and unnecessarily European approach for an American-made car, it made sense within the context of its economy mindset, because it was appealing in a sporty way, even as it wasn't made to be a sporty car, but it was still small and cheap, it was affordable. I mean, even the more pricey Monza Coupe model would have run around $2,300, which hovers around $24,000 today. For a base model that was typically under $2,000, you were paying the equivalent of around $21,000 today. Could it stand to be cheaper? Of course, everything could be. But generally speaking, this was a very desirable car that could be had for less than the cost of... What was something expensive in the 60s? I don't know, a handshake from your father. Now, this would receive a turbocharged engine option in 1962 and an increased 2.7-liter displacement in 1964. And yet this was still a compact people mover first and foremost. Production numbers exceeded 200,000 units per year in its first generation, and in some cases topped 300,000 units. There was demand for this car. And by any metric, the Corvair was an early success and seemed on track to become a long-term moneymaker for GM. Ed Cole was even promoted to the vice presidency of the GM Car and Truck Group in 1961, amid the success of the Corvair, which was basically a big mission accomplished for Cole and his team. A real attaboy, So... if the Corvair was so successful, why are we here? Where did it all go wrong? Before we do anything else, we need to talk about Ralph Nader. Now, Ralph Nader had an interesting life long before anybody knew who he was. Born to Lebanese immigrants, his father made him turn down a scholarship to Princeton since his family could afford to pay the tuition, and he felt scholarships should go to those whose families couldn't, which is a pretty cool philosophy to hold. And of course, Nader did end up attending Princeton anyway, and after graduating, he attended Harvard Law, only to disappear for days on end to hitchhike across the country learning about Puerto Rico. Wepa! And the rights of Native Americans and migrant workers. Nader just never seemed to gel with what he believed to be Harvard's unspoken mission statement to create individuals who would reinforce the status quo. As he would later say of his time at Harvard Law, quote, "From day one, I laughed at the game. to prepare corporate lawyers. If anyone fell off the bandwagon and became a lawyer for the poor, it was viewed as a random event. They made minds sharp by making them narrow." End quote. Nader was committed to effecting change in one way or another. So upon graduating from Harvard Law, I guess Nader's personal history becomes a jumble of different lives lived in fast forward. He graduates from Harvard, but then he's a cook in the Army. He's practicing law in Hartford, Connecticut, but then he's working as a reporter for various publications, interviewing people like Fidel Castro and Salvador Allende. He's living in Washington, D.C., working in the Kennedy administration under Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But then he's writing a manuscript that would go on to become a bestseller, but not before losing it in a taxicab and having to rewrite it all over again because, in his words, he wouldn't give GM the satisfaction of not eventually publishing his book. And mind you, this is all in a roughly 10-year time span. It's a very Forrest Gumpian life. And I say all this as a way of explaining his activist political past to set up his work in automotive regulation and reform. But honestly, by the time the Corvair released in 1960, Nader had been critical of the auto industry for years. He had been studying automotive safety since his second year at Harvard Law, and was committed to seeing a government agency implement some kind of law to improve safety. He'd even written an article for The Nation in 1959, titled "The Safe Car You Can't Buy," in which his arguments similarly boiled down to how cars were being designed with, quote, "style, cost, performance, and calculated obsolescence, but not," despite the 5 million reported accidents, nearly 40,000 fatalities, 110,000 permanent disabilities, and 1,500,000 injuries yearly, "for safety." End quote. Now, this article was essentially what got him his job with Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who'd written his own article about how companies like Ford had cut back on safety initiatives after realizing that safety-focused advertising resulted in lower sales. Of course, then Ford executive Lee Iacocca would later balk at this assertion, stating that he'd never said safety doesn't sell, but instead lamented how the public didn't respond to their earnest efforts to promote safety. Either way, it was while working with Moynihan that Nader wrote his book. Titled "Unsafe at Any Speed: The Designed-In Dangers of the American Automobile," the book took aim at the entire auto industry, yet its most famous chapter was its first, titled "The Sporty Corvair." Ooh. Yeah, I know, it's not really that spooky or anything. It's really kind of a chapter that focuses on how the Corvair was the perfect representation of the recklessness of the auto industry. Because here you had a car whose swing axle suspension layout didn't have any sort of front stabilizer bar, which exacerbated the issue of having a car that was so heavy in the rear you'd think it had a BBL. Now, while a rear bias isn't inherently dangerous, the unique suspension configuration supposedly made the Corvair more accident-prone, at least theoretically. As a 2022 Popular Mechanics article would explain, the independent rear suspension, quote, allowed the axles to flex, making the rear wheels articulate at extreme angles, potentially culminating in a sudden loss of traction, end quote. Essentially, the suspension, coupled with the weight, created a pendulum-like effect that could cause a wheel to tuck under the body and lead to a rollover. And this is before getting into the tire pressure requirements, which Corvair owners supposedly weren't even informed about by salesmen, or by Chevrolet beyond a mention buried in the owner's manual, I believe. Yet, even if they had been more directly informed, the pressures themselves presented a danger. as the lower inflation on the front tires meant they were being seriously stressed out under heavy loads, phrasing. At best, it made handling a nightmare, and at worst, it made the car seriously unstable, because the book went as far as to argue that GM had ignored a recommendation by its chief engineer to add an anti-roll bar to the car, as it was considered too expensive, apparently. Which I guess is sort of indirectly borne out by Charles Rubley's claim that the suspension layout had been chosen in the first place as a way of lowering costs and weight. And this all ties back to Nader's argument that safety concerns were subordinate to aesthetic goals and pure numbers. Sure, there were aftermarket solutions like the EMPI camber compensator, but again, you had to know you needed this in the first place in order to seek it out. And your average consumer doesn't really know about suspensions like that. However, the suspension wasn't Nader's only bone of contention, as he called out the RNDL pattern on the Powerglide transmission for not having a P option, instead providing drivers with just a parking brake. Granted, Nader did credit the Corvair with improving on earlier transmissions, which had a habit of putting the R after the L, resulting in drivers thinking they were in low when they were really in reverse. But he still felt the Corvair ultimately came up short. And if all of this sounds like excessive nitpicking, plenty of automotive enthusiasts and industry people agreed then and now. But for Nader, it was part of a longer critique of the perceived neglect of automotive safety. The book criticized interior designs for causing damage in the second collision, or the contact between the human body and the infrastructure of the car following the initial collision of the car with an outside force. The book also called out interior features for contributing to glare, and it detailed the pollution cars put out into the atmosphere, and argued against overly bright headlights 60 years before I did. He even laid out how mechanical changes to improve safety would actually be less expensive than a lot of the design changes implemented in annual model refreshes. Nader wasn't just focused on any singular aspect of automotive safety, but how misguided design priorities, in their totality, failed drivers. Now, of course, Nader wasn't the only person drawing attention to a perceived lack of safety in the Corvair. By the time Nader's book released in 1965, GM already had a small avalanche of pending cases, with some sources claiming it was in the 80s, and others stating it was well over 100. I even saw one source say it was over 200, which, I could kind of believe that. A 1965 Time magazine article detailed the active litigation against GM at the time over the Corvair, noting that while GM had been absolved of legal responsibility in the death of a 1960 Corvair driver in California, the jury verdict was more of an indictment of the driver's inexperience than a judgment, positive or negative, on the Corvair's reliability. However, GM did end up winning a subsequent case in Clearwater, Florida in 1963 that featured a more rigorous defense of the Corvair itself. Florida state legislators James T. Russell and David C. Anderson were on their way home from a legislative session in Tallahassee in Russell's 1962 Corvair Monza. Everything seemed fine until, basically, it wasn't. Russell lost control of the vehicle, the car overturned, and Anderson was essentially thrown out the passenger door. Both men were rushed to the hospital. Russell would survive, but Anderson would pass away 6 days after the accident. Unexpectedly, Anderson's widow sued Russell over the accident, before agreeing to an out-of-court settlement and then teaming up with him to not only sue General Motors, but also the Corvair dealer who sold Russell the car, and the tire manufacturer who made the tires. However, the judge directed acquittal verdicts for the dealer and the tire manufacturer, so that meant this was a case against GM and no one else. The attorneys for Russell and Anderson's widow claimed that GM didn't make the doors strong enough to survive a rollover, and cited the rear axle as a key design flaw that caused the accident. And while you might think this would be a legal argument without a whole lot of precedent, considering by this point GM had yet to lose an actual tort action over the design of the Corvair, there was definitely an argument to be made that the Corvair had resulted in unnecessary loss of life, following the death of influential and world-renowned comedian Ernie Kovacs. The accident occurred shortly after 2 a.m., on January 13, 1962, just 10 days before Ernie Kovacs' 43rd birthday. Kovacs was leaving the home of Oscar-winning director Billy Wilder, who had been hosting a baby shower in honor of the wife of comedian Milton Berle. Kovacs' Chevy Corvair station wagon reportedly hit a patch of wet pavement roughly half a block from the Beverly Hilton Hotel on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Los Angeles. The car struck a pole, and the resulting impact was said to have killed Kovacs instantly. Kovacs' wife, actress Edie Adams, who'd taken a separate car home from the baby shower, reportedly refused to believe that her husband was dead, and was so distraught that the responsibility of identifying the body fell to Kovacs' close friend, Hollywood legend Jack Lemmon. And yet, the scrutiny wasn't immediately zeroed in on the Corvair. For one, there was the wet pavement explanation. But also, a traffic policeman on the scene told reporters that they believed Kovacs may have been driving above the posted speed limit. In a sense, sure, maybe it was the car, but also, maybe it was driver error. So while GM had been subject to litigation over the Corvair, it didn't seem as though the company had suffered serious reputational damage yet. But everything changes when it's a celebrity who's the victim. And this reputational damage was further amplified by the Russell and Anderson tragedy. To strengthen their case, GM's defense brought in one of their own engineers, a man by the name of Horatio Shakespeare, along with a metallurgist from the University of Illinois and an accident specialist from UCLA, to reconstruct similar accidents using 3 cars, illustrating that the car was sturdier than the prosecution claimed. And as a result, the jury only took 13 hours to find in favor of General Motors. It was another victory for one of America's big 3 automakers, and seemingly amounted to vindication for a car that had gotten a lot of negative publicity, which, at least to GM brass, had been unfairly leveled. And yet, while GM's defense lawyer became a fan of the Corvair as a result of acquiring one in preparation for the trial, he made an admission that was somewhat telling, particularly in the aftermath of what happened to Ernie Kovacs. Quote, "It drives wonderfully. I don't drive it over 80, though." End quote. And while it probably seems like common sense that you shouldn't drive any car at excessive speeds, much less a car that isn't inherently designed for that kind of acceleration, again, that relies on your average driver knowing as much, and exercising that level of caution and forethought. In a way, you could say Nader was arguing that it was the responsibility of automakers to design their cars in such a way as to compensate for a driver's lack of skill or knowledge by prioritizing their safety over their comfort or stylistic satisfaction. It was kind of arguing for this parental approach from automakers. Like, we know what's good for you even if you don't, so we're gonna look out for you, because you don't have the good sense to look out for yourself. I'm your dad, this is what I sound like. Unsafe at Any Speed became one of the best sellers of 1966, launching Nader into the public spotlight and increasing his profile for consumer advocacy efforts and automotive safety regulation tenfold. To say people had a greater awareness of the safety shortcomings in most domestically produced cars of that time would be an understatement. People were outraged, and litigation against GM actually increased in the years that followed the book, and accidents that might have been back-page news were getting more attention, resulting in more drivers being encouraged to file lawsuits. At least, that appeared to be GM's take on things. We don't actually know how many of the subsequent lawsuits against GM were compelled by the book making those people believe they had a case, and how many were genuine accidents that weren't the fault of the driver or the road conditions, but the Corvair itself. But no matter the reason for these lawsuits, General Motors really wasn't happy. And they were going to do something about it. Nader's consumer advocacy efforts in the wake of the release of Unsafe at Any Speed both directly and indirectly led to some of the changes for which he'd long been campaigning, such as getting seatbelt laws on the books in every state but New Hampshire for some reason. Subsequent Senate hearings in 1966 that came as a response to the book's assertions led to the creation of the United States Department of Transportation, the forerunner to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. All because of one book. Nader actually was the guy M. Night Shyamalan wrote himself to be in Lady in the Water. He wrote a book that changed the world, in one way or another. But doing this didn't just make Nader an enemy to future auto enthusiasts who felt like he was overreacting or overreaching. It made him an enemy in his own time to General Motors. And GM didn't exactly have... they didn't have the healthiest response to being called out. As Nader would recall in a 2018 interview with Marketplace, an unsettling encounter would lead to Nader and GM finding themselves on opposite ends of a courtroom. It occurred prior to the Senate hearings in 1966 that would lead to the creation of the Department of Transportation, as GM was reportedly looking to discredit Nader and his book. Naturally, you want to discredit somebody, you start a smear campaign. But a smear campaign requires dirt, and dirt requires surveillance. As Nader recalls, quote, "I went to the Senate office building one day, and I was followed by a GM paid detective, and he lost track of me. I guess I went on an elevator, he went up, and then he went down. So, like out of a movie. And so he went to the guard and said, 'Have you seen someone who looks like this?' And the guard said, 'What are you asking that kind of question for? What are you doing here?' And it turned out that it was traced back to General Motors." End quote. So yeah, as it turns out, GM hired a private agency to look into Nader to get dirt on the guy and undermine the work of his book. Now, while it was later asserted that whoever hired the agency never intended for the surveillance to go as far as it did, this seemed to be more than just trying to gather information to use in the Senate hearings. To the untrained eye, it kind of looked like the beginning of a campaign of intimidation. As later court documents would recount, these detectives allegedly acting on behalf of GM, quote, "1. Conducted a series of interviews with acquaintances of the plaintiff, questioning them about and casting aspersions upon his political, social, racial, and religious views, his integrity, his sexual proclivities and inclinations, and his personal habits. 2. Kept him under surveillance in public places for an unreasonable length of time. 3. caused him to be accosted by girls for the purpose of entrapping him into illicit relationships. 4. Made threatening, harassing, and obnoxious telephone calls to him. 5. Tapped his telephone and eavesdropped by means of mechanical and electronic equipment on his private conversations with others. And 6. Conducted a continuing and harassing investigation of him. End quote. It was enough of a public black eye that GM President James Roche had to appear in front of a Senate subcommittee to apologize for the harassment, likely to avoid catching a lawsuit over invasion of privacy. Yet the apology didn't really admit to harassment, as the company claimed to only want to know if Nader was in league with the personal injury lawyers who were suing them. Of course, the irony of this is that the apology occurred on March 22, 1966. Unsafe at Any Speed was a success when it released in late 1965, but it didn't actually reach the bestseller list until April of 1966, where it stayed until July of that same year. So there's a very real possibility that if not for GM's surveillance of and campaign against Nader and the resulting publicity from the scandal, the book may not have become the force that it eventually did. It was an unforced error the size of Watergate, some 6 years before that scandal sank the Nixon presidency. And what's wild is that the worst of it wasn't even over for GM, because Nader then turned around and sued GM for invasion of privacy anyway. The two parties reached a settlement to the tune of some $425,000, which Nader then used to further investigate General Motors, quote, in the safety, pollution, and consumer relations area, end quote. He also used it to fund the creation of the nonprofit Center for Auto Safety, with his subsequent lobbying efforts being credited with inspiring the unanimous passage of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which created a set of federally mandated safety standards for automobiles. Ralph Nader is also credited with inspiring the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the passage of the Clean Air Act. And while not exactly an unbiased source, a study by the Center for Auto Safety notes that Nader's activism has saved more than 3.5 million lives, as auto fatalities were reportedly cut by 80% in the years that followed. And for what it's worth, I believe that number. If anything, it almost seems a little low, because if you want to credit him with helping to get seatbelts standardized everywhere but New Hampshire for some reason, dude has probably indirectly helped save tens of millions of lives. In fact, 2014 findings by the New York Times noted that in 1965, there were 5 deaths for every 100 million miles traveled. By 2014, it was 1 death for every 100 million miles. I'm not going to sit here and say that Ralph Nader was perfect, but I list his accomplishments as a way of showing that everything he did in the aftermath of Unsafe at Any Speed had an effect that would survive and outlast all of the hoopla surrounding the book itself, and have long-term effects not just on the auto industry, but on this country. Because of these regulations, lives were provably saved, even if accomplishing that meant that the Corvair's life couldn't be. And yet, that's kind of misleading, isn't it? Nader didn't really kill the Corvair. Or if he did, he didn't do it alone. Believe it or not, GM was already intending to phase out the Corvair long before Nader's book released, planning to replace it with the Chevy 2 Compact. The company also intended to direct resources into creating a car that could compete with the unexpected sales juggernaut known as the Mustang. But perhaps compelled to keep the car alive a little longer just to disprove Nader's book, the Corvair stuck around for a second generation. And the model was vastly improved, getting a fully independent rear suspension, replacing the swing axle setup, and gaining a standard front stabilizer bar and finned rear drum brakes. It supposedly handled like a completely different car. Hell, Car and Driver infamously raved about the 1965 model, proclaiming that while it didn't go fast enough, they still loved it, declaring it, quote, the most important new car of the entire crop of 65 models, and the most beautiful car to appear in this country since before World War II. The new rear suspension, the new softer spring rates in front, the bigger brakes, the addition of some more power. All these factors had us driving around like idiots, zooming around the handling loop, dragging with each other, standing on the brakes, until we had to reluctantly turn the car over to some other impatient journalist. End quote. Yet the improvements didn't really mean much for sales in the aftermath of Unsafe at Any Speed, and all the negative attention from the lawsuits and the spying fiasco. By 1968, the company wasn't even really advertising the car that much anymore, and by 1969, Corvair brochures were only sent out by specific request. The car that had once regularly topped 200,000 production units in its first generation went out with a final year production output of just 6,000 in 1969. The Corvair was sunk, and I suppose the comfort for Corvair enthusiasts who felt it got a bad rap is in the fact that Nader's book may have led to us even getting a second generation of the car in the first place. But frustratingly, the book also precluded the car from ever getting past its reputation as the one-car accident. The car was never really given a fair second chance by a lot of the public. Once it was branded as dangerous, there was really no coming back. So, I guess after all of the manufacturing challenges, the litigation, the spying, the settlements, and the discontinuation, this just leaves us with one question. Was the Corvair really that dangerous? In an article for Rust magazine, author Mike Blanchard notes that despite all the public outcry, GM never actually lost a product liability case by judgment. Although they settled the first case brought against them, they won the next three, which had all been brought against them by the same law firm, which sort of explains GM's paranoia about Ralph Nader somehow being in league with the personal injury lawyers coming after them, because the lawsuits, I guess, would have seemed somewhat strategic. At the last of these three trials, in 1965, the judge proclaimed, quote, "It is the court's conclusion that the Corvair automobile of the 1960 through 1963 variety is not defectively designed, nor a defective product, that no negligence was involved in the manufacturer's adoption of the Corvair design." End quote. The court's judgment reflected some of the criticisms of anti-Corvair, pro-Nader rhetoric. For instance, remember that tidy figure of the reduction in deaths per 100 million miles? Well, although 5 deaths per 100 million miles traveled is terrible, as economist Thomas Sowell would point out, this was a notable improvement, as the death rate of roughly 5 deaths per 100 million miles was a decrease from 17.9 deaths per 100 million miles between 1925 and 1965. Additionally, David E. Cole, the son of the Corvair's father, Ed Cole, which I suppose would sort of make the Corvair his brother, noted that he himself was a test driver for the Corvair, and he didn't believe his dad would have ever allowed him to be had he believed it was a dangerous car. As Cole told the New York Times in 2015, his father believed that Nader simply didn't understand the complexity of automotive engineering, and felt that unsafe at any speed encouraged people to sue automakers. That was his opinion, of course, but he wasn't likely to have been the only one who shared it. Even in the immediate aftermath of unsafe at any speed, independent tests were conducted by automotive journalists to attempt to judge the validity of Nader's claims. Mechanics Illustrated went so far as to drift sideways into a curb to try and flip a 1963 Corvair, and couldn't do it. Which one would think suggests that while the Corvair might have been dangerous, it might only have been dangerous under very specific and difficult to replicate conditions that would place it on roughly the same danger level as any other average car on the road. Yet the biggest vindication that the Corvair received came years after its discontinuation, as the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration conducted numerous tests in 1971, investigating the mechanical competency of the 1963 Chevrolet Corvair when compared against 4 of its contemporaries: the Volkswagen Beetle, the Ford Falcon, the Plymouth Valiant, and the Renault Dauphine. Dauphine? The NHTSA's report not only tested handling in a variety of different conditions, but collated insurance and traffic data, and GM's own internal memos and reports on the Corvair. They even formulated a 3-person panel of professional engineers to review the Corvair. The findings? The report found that, quote, the 1960 to 63 Corvair compares favorably with contemporary vehicles used in the tests. The handling and stability performance of the 1960 to 63 Corvair does not result in an abnormal potential for loss of control or rollover, and it is at least as good as the performance of some contemporary vehicles, both foreign and domestic. End quote. The U.S. Department of Transportation issued a press release on August 12, 1972, revealing the findings of the NHTSA report and essentially vindicating the Corvair, some 3 years after it had been discontinued. Yet, even in the wake of the Corvair's vindication, Nader never recanted his claims against the car. For what it's worth, some within GM agreed with Nader's assessment. John DeLorean, whose controversial and scandalous life was previously covered at length in his own RCR Stories video, was Chevrolet's former general manager. And in the 1979 book, On a Clear Day You Can See General Motors, he expressed his belief that Nader was fair in his criticisms of General Motors and its corporate culture. There's been a lot of debate in the decades that followed over whether or not the Corvair was actually safe, and the extent to which that lack of safety was due to factors external to the car itself. The relative rarity of those first-generation models makes it difficult for most modern motorists to see for themselves. Not that I would ever recommend your average motorist even try, you know? There's no point in tracking this down just to drive it crazy to see if it really is that dangerous. But I guess the point I'm ultimately trying to make is that the Corvair became the cause célèbre for the neglect of the auto industry, when in reality, other automakers had been making vehicles with similar suspensions to very little public scrutiny. If anything, one could argue that the tire pressure requirements were more detrimental than the suspension, since it threw the car off balance with the weight of multiple passengers. But then that's just one argument, because some of the most well-known accidents that I could find seem to never involve more than one other passenger. So perhaps the central issue, then, is not only one of potential driver error or design insufficiency, but something that has plagued GM off and on in the decades since this scandal. A simple issue of build quality. The second and final generation of the Corvair was celebrated as one of the finest cars of its time, and a lot of it is chalked up to the overall build quality and the skillful design. Without going over all the different models and trims, let it suffice to say that the second generation showed the potential for a Corvair that could stand the test of time as a giant in the auto industry, had General Motors invested a greater resource of money and patience into its development from the get-go. But then you could say that of any car that failed in the wake of seemingly limitless potential. Sometimes, that's just what it is to be remembered. To live on as a perennial what if. Ralph Nader would become a fixture of the American political landscape, most notably running for president in 2000 as a third-party candidate. It's long been theorized that Nader drawing votes away from Al Gore led to the narrow election of George W. Bush, as the race was among the closest in American electoral history. And without issuing a political opinion, I'd say you can make the case for how the existence of the Chevrolet Corvair indirectly made Nader a household name because of his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And this gave him enough boost to see further lobbying efforts succeed, which gave juice to his potential political career, resulting in him becoming enough of a political fixture to make for a viable third-party spoiler candidate, thereby resulting in making George W. Bush the president. In that sense, you can either credit or blame the Chevy Corvair for the timeline we're living in now, if you wanted to go full butterfly effect with it. But then, that's a real stretch. There's more to it than just one car knocking over the first domino. History doesn't really work that way, does it? And even if it did, this isn't solely Nader's story. For instance, Ed Cole continued at GM following the decline of the Corvair. He was made vice president in 1965 and became president of General Motors in 1967. He would also be the chief engineer behind the Chevy Vega, and in 1970 would oversee the reduction in engine compression ratios to meet increased regulations in the decade ahead. He would retire from GM in 1974, having accomplished more to prepare General Motors for the future than most executives who ever worked there, helping the company get away from leaded gasoline and adopting catalytic converters, as explained in a Hemmings Classic Car profile on Cole. Interestingly, roughly a month after his retirement from General Motors, and some 2 years after the Corvair was vindicated, Cole debated Nader on the Phil Donahue Show in a special 2-hour broadcast. Reportedly, once the broadcast ended, Cole shook Nader's hand and said, quote, "Give me a little credit from now on. I showed up." End quote. To which Nader responded, quote, "You got the lead out of gasoline. Now how about getting the lead out of GM?" End quote. While the two men seemed about as different as you could realistically expect, the Hemmings Classic Car article calls attention to an overlooked aspect of Cole's life that draws an interesting parallel with Harvard Law graduate Nader. In his youth, Ed Cole wanted to be a lawyer, but his natural talent for engineering shone through, as he'd rebuilt 2 cars before he'd even graduated college. Perhaps this debate with Nader, serving as the defense for the Corvair against Nader's prosecutorial acumen, was his opportunity to realize that childhood goal, if only for a moment. An avid aviation enthusiast, Cole had trouble flying in later years, becoming disoriented during a landing attempt on April 28, 1977. This resulted in a Federal Aviation Administration investigation into Cole. Just a few days later, on May 2, 1977, during a flight near Kalamazoo, Michigan, while in transit to Checker Motor Corporation, where he had accepted an executive position, Cole again became disoriented while attempting to fly by instrument in what the Detroit Free Press described as, quote, poor visibility and weather conditions, end quote. His plane went down, and Cole did not survive the subsequent crash. Upon his death at age 67, Cole was remembered with a service attended by more than 400 mourners. That same year, he would be inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame, an accolade that would later be shared by Ralph Nader, who would be inducted in 2016. For his part, Nader has continued his activism and has been awarded with numerous mentions on lists detailing the most influential Americans of the modern era, and even receiving a Gandhi Peace Award in 2016 from peace advocacy organization promoting enduring peace. He did try to run for president 2 more times after 2000, but the 2.7% share of the vote he received that year was the closest he'd ever get, as his 2004 and 2008 runs saw him top out at 0.4 and 0.6%, respectively, both of which were weaker performances than his first presidential run in 1996, where he received a whopping 0.7% of the vote. As for the Corvair, you can still find them today, although the second generation is more common than the first. Classics.com shows that the average sale price is around $15,864, with the most recent recorded sale as of this writing going for $22,000, while the highest was $82,500. This suggests that while these cars might not necessarily be easy to find, they're still desirable. Maybe only because of their rarity, yes, but it's every bit as possible that enthusiasts genuinely want to experience these cars. I mean, that's why they're enthusiasts. I know I do, if for no other reason than to see what all the fuss is about. Automotive history is strange in that way because it's an accessible, living history that sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to experience yourself. I'm glad that at least some examples of the Corvair are still out there to experience, even if not everybody will get the chance to have that experience. Sure, maybe it deserved a better life, a longer life, and a fairer reputation. Or maybe it received the treatment it earned. But not everything is as cut and dry as a car just being bad or being good. There's typically a whole lot more to the story on why it's assessed the way it is, and disagreements on that assessment. The legacy of the Chevy Corvair is as a car that led to a lot of sweeping change in the auto industry that, ironically, ended up saving a whole lot more lives than it could ever credibly be accused of claiming. For that reason alone, it has to be among the most important American cars ever produced. But what do you think? Did the Corvair deserve its reputation, or was it unfairly maligned? How about Ralph Nader? Was he justified in his approach, or was he overreaching? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments, and I want to respond to them. Be on the lookout for me. I'll be using my personal screen name of Limited Time Roman. I love interacting with you all, I really do. If you liked this video, please consider sharing it, clicking the like button, commenting, or even subscribing. And if you do, be sure to tap the bell icon so you're notified for every new video, because we don't want you to miss any of it. And if you want to support us in the biggest possible way, consider joining our Patreon, where you can get videos like these early, along with other exclusive content. It helps make these historical videos possible, since I really couldn't do them without your support. Lastly, for every new order from our merch store linked in the description or in the product shelf below the video, I'll send you a personalized thank you video. Thank you so much for watching. You make this the most rewarding job in the world, and I'm proud for the opportunity to earn your viewership. So thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your week, no matter when you're watching this.
Hello, you've reached the end of the video. I'm proud of you. If you come this far, I know you want to go farther. RCR's Patreon has tons of more content and all the stuff that I can't get away with on YouTube anymore. It's fun, it's bawdy, and it's extra dirty. And for $1, you get all of it. That's it. Less than the cost of a Costco hot dog. $1, you get double the content. You know what else? If everybody who watched this video joined our Patreon, RCR would be unstoppable. There's no telling what we could do with your support. So please, go to the Patreon, join it. It's only $1. Thank you so much, and thank you for liking Regular Car Reviews.